Chapter 32, ProWrestleMachine. Over the next weeks, as I drove seemingly endless miles of highway between smaller venues from New York State to Wisconsin, I occupied my mind by studying all the angles to my upcoming match with Owen at WrestleMania 10. Being Vince's top seller in merchandise was rewarding me with an extra $200,000 per year in royalties, so whatever I did, I had to be careful not to jeopardize that. I thought that Owen's prospects as a cute, bad-tempered underdog, much like the original Hitman character, were really looking up. I couldn't go too soft or too hard on him. I'd need to devise spots that would highlight his high flying while still keeping him heel. I'd have to cleverly out-wrestle him, with a tinge of reluctance and regret. On any given night my view from a bar stool was much the same. Taker was never far off, tipping back a shot of Jack Daniels, his big arms blue with tattoos of skulls and crosses in the dim bar light. Referee Joey Morella would be off in a corner doing his imitation of Freddie, the gay ref from Boston, bugging his eyes out, arching his back and sticking out his butt, much to the amusement of the ring crew, refs and agents. Yoko usually sat at the bar puffing on a cigarette and stirring a vodka and Diet Coke. Never far away were his two fellow Samoans, the head shrinkers Samu and Fatu. They were said to be related to Yoko, but the joke was that all the Samoan wrestlers claimed to be brothers. They were worried about Yoko's weight. Since winning the belt, he'd gone from 450 to 600 pounds. He'd stuff his face with hot dogs and candy bars in the dressing room, but then, like a hot-tempered hippopotamus, he'd kick over tubs of ice sodas because there was no Diet Coke left. Sean, Razor, 1-2-3 Kid and Diesel often asked me for advice on anything from their matches to life on the road. I guess they thought I was a good guy to talk to because I never had any axes to grind. But I was more than a little pissed off when Sean went to Vince and stole my idea for a ladder match, proposing that he try it on at WrestleMania 10 with Razor. It was hard to complain since I was getting the belt back, but that didn't make it right. With house show business down across North America, Vince was setting up more foreign tours than ever before to many countries we'd never visited. The wrestling phenomenon was reborn in places such as Hong Kong, Singapore, Philippines, the Middle East and India. The future was calling for me to be a real world champion, the first one actually to wrestle all over the world, even in Japan, where the WWF would soon go head-to-head for the first time with the deep-rooted empires of New Japan and All Japan. I held no allegiance to either and welcomed the chance to return to Japan as the WWF champion. On March 12, Hogan showed up, sitting in the front row of WCW's Saturday night TV show. Vince was hurt but told me that he was going to let Terry go. The real war between the WWF and WCW started right then and there. He also told me he'd rather have 10 Bret Harts than 1 Hulk Hogan. I didn't know how to take that, coming from Vince. 3 days before WrestleMania X, Owen and I met in Stu's dungeon to construct an entirely different match from the one we had planned. We sat on the old, frayed medicine balls and cleared our heads. I looked at Owen and said, "We're changing everything. This is what we're gonna do." When I set my bag down in the dressing room at Madison Square Garden on March 20th, the Wrestling Observer was being passed around. Even before I got the belt back, Dave Meltzer was predicting that my days as champion were numbered. I'd been in New York for a few days already doing media and appearances, and with 2 big matches, it was going to be a long day. I had the heavy responsibility of opening and closing the pay-per-view in what was expected to be the biggest grossing show of the year. Julie, Carlo and Gord Kirk had all come to New York to celebrate the big moment, along with New York film agent Michael Frankfurt, whom Carlo was whining and dining. My parents couldn't be there because my mom was having problems with her heart and had been in the hospital. Lawler was back, the heat from his statutory rape charge being judged to have cooled off enough. The charge was eventually dropped, and he used my mom's illness as part of the storyline, saying that the stress of her 2 sons doing battle was too much for her to bear. I have to say that of all the celebrities Vince hired over the years for WrestleMania, none was more cooperative and happy to be there than Burt Reynolds, who was our guest announcer that night. My music played, and as I made my way to the ring the noise of the New York fans was like fuel in my veins. I kept repeating to myself, "Keep Owen heel." He and I clicked perfectly. He played the nasty little brother, cheating viciously at every turn, and I kept outsmarting him, but never in a way that made me look overconfident or cocky. It was a real back-and-forth struggle, and led into working the match around me injuring my knee. Owen went at my leg like a cat attacking a crippled bird. We had the greatest haul of them all coming apart at the seams, 23,000 fans locked into every move. I slammed Owen's thick chest with some hard lifters. He swung for my head with a fist, but I slipped under it. Sleeper. Owen desperately fought his way to the ropes, forcing me to break the hold. He kicked his leg back for a vicious ball shot that left me writhing on the mat. This really got the crowd hot. I was so happy for him that they hated him. He dragged me to the middle of the ring, twisting me into the sharpshooter. The fans suddenly realized that Stu must have taught it to both of us. Nobody had ever got out of the sharpshooter, there was no known escape. I twisted, reaching around to hook Owen's ankle, and pulled his leg out from under him, sending him toppling chest first to the mat. The fans were standing as I rose from the ashes like a phoenix, having somehow maneuvered Owen into the sharpshooter instead. But Owen clawed his way to the ropes again. With the crowd hanging on every move, he charged me in the corner, and I caught him square on the chin with a boot, spinning him completely around. I climbed up on his shoulders and dove forward for a victory roll, but in a split second, Owen collapsed in a squat on top of me, pinning my shoulders to the mat for the 1, 2, 3. We came back to the dressing room to backslaps and congratulations from all. Yoko was walking around like he was on death row. It was just dawning on him that he was about to lose the top money spot. I knew how it felt. Like all ex-champions, he was immediately uncertain of his future. He went on to have a horrible match with Lex, who was unable to garner much sympathy. In a lame finish, the guest referee, Mr. Perfect, disqualified Lex for touching him, and the fans seemed glad when it was over. Not surprisingly, the ladder match between Shawn and Razor stole the show, and why wouldn't it? Even though I'd asked Shawn not to use my original finish, where the heel falls off the ladder and crotches himself on the top rope, he went ahead and crotched himself and tied his foot up in the ropes, while Razor climbed up and took the Intercontinental belt. I watched it on the monitor in the back thinking, you thieving bastard. Finally, Yoko and I enacted our usual David and Goliath story. Soon I was dragged to a corner so Yoko could squash me like a grape for his finish. He climbed up on the second rope, then slipped and toppled backward. I was quick to move out of the way, because if he landed on me for real he'd most certainly kill me. I was on him like a monkey on a beach ball, hooking his big leg to reclaim the WWF World Heavyweight title. The rafters shook when guest referee Roddy Piper proudly raised my arm in victory. The ring filled up with wrestlers, Lex, Tatanka, Razor, Kid, and then I saw Gorilla, Pat, Vince, and even Burt Reynolds in the ring. Macho Man charged out and gave me a hug. He had tears in his eyes when he said, "I'm proud of you, brother. You deserve it." Then Roddy and Randy, two legends, pulled all the boys to pick me up. Like in a dream, suddenly I was back in grade 8 on my friend's shoulders after I had punched out that bully Brett McFarlane. It's curious that at WrestleMania X, a total work, I felt a similar kind of triumph. I saw Julie, Carlo and Gord in the audience clapping. Owen stood in the aisle glaring at me with burning blue eyes. Despite how he pretended to seethe, he was so happy, he could have kissed me. This was one of the greatest nights of my life, arguably the highlight of my career, and I was grateful that a beaming Vince had given us this moment. I was exhausted and dripping in Yoko's sweat in the hallway when suddenly Julie was beside me. She was wearing a nice new outfit, and when I didn't give her a sopping wet hug, she misinterpreted it. By 3 in the morning, the celebration canceled, Julie was gripping her suitcase with her eyes ablaze. "Brett, I want a divorce. We're done. And I mean it this time." She slammed the door behind her. I expected her to come back, but she didn't. When I showed up for TV in Poughkeepsie the next day, I was as deflated as I'd ever been. My heart felt abandoned and scorched, with bits of ash blowing around in it, and yet I was champion of the world. For the next several days I toured England feeling so despondent about Julie that even being mobbed by fans didn't make me feel better. I called home on her birthday, but the phone bleeped and bleeped. I could only assume that she was out with her friends. When I dropped my bags on the dressing room floor at the Royal Albert Hall, I remembered the last time I wrestled there 13 years earlier. It occurred to me that Julie was leaving me then too. Things hadn't changed. Every night Owen and I worked an even better match than the night before. It was always the pop of the night when I reversed Owen's sharpshooter and came up with mine, with a remorseless Owen tapping out. We'd perfected the story of what a mean little brother he was. Between matches Owen occupied himself with orchestrating ribs in the dressing room. One of his latest victims was Oscar, the fat rapper manager of a new black tag team called Men on a Mission, or MOM. 300-pound Mo was cool and mellow with a dyed white buzz cut and carried the team. Mabel was a 450-pound mass with a white mohawk, who didn't do much but stand there in hideous, baggy purple silk pants. But their gimmick capitalized on the new rap sound, and when Oscar came out shouting on the live mic, "Get your hands up in the air," he really pumped up the crowd. Owen egged on the 1-2-3 Kid until he tried to seize the heavy, out-of-shape Oscar in close quarters. Kid expected to manhandle Oscar and jumped right on his back, but Oscar panicked, charging back and forth into the walls and knocking Kid silly. Back in Israel, I was touched to see a street kid about 8 years old waiting to greet me at my hotel. He was wearing a crudely sewn pink and black replica of my ring outfit and holding a cardboard sign that read, "Hitman New Rel World Champion." I put my arm around him and asked who helped him make his outfit. In broken English he proudly explained that he had made it all by himself and added, "I don't want to bother you. I just want to look at you. You are my hero." When the bus pulled away for double shots in Haifa and Halon, the boy rode his bike alongside, popping wheelies and giving me the bullhorn sign. At every traffic light he'd catch up and wait below my window so he could pull his Hitman shades down and pop another wheelie just for me. He kept up with us for miles. Soon the boys on the bus were cheering him on. Just when we thought he couldn't keep up anymore, he'd come around a corner and give me the bullhorn sign, until he finally faded into the distance. I never saw him again. I loved that little boy. I finished off the tour in Tel Aviv with Owen, on last in the main event, Pro Wrestling's version of Cain vs. Abel. Later that evening I strolled down the soft, brown sugar sand behind the Holiday Inn in Tel Aviv. Another beautiful night, the black sky filled with stars and the red blinking lights of Israeli military jets fading in and out between clouds. The shore was still lined with barricades that looked like giant steel jacks glistening in the moonlight. The girl from last time gave me a long kiss good night and walked out of my life forever. The scent of her perfume lingered as I lay in bed tasting her on my lips. What started out as a slow tremor of guilt soon thumped in my chest, and like something had suddenly taken over my controls, I grabbed for the phone to call Julie. It was a long call, but we patched up our battered warship and sailed on, again. I told her if things went right for me as champ I really could be home in only 3 more years and asked if she could last. She said she could, but I heard the sob in her voice and felt like a real bastard as I smelled the Israeli girl on my fingers. The world was my cage, and home was a dream that I wet my lips on. At the end of April, I called my mom to tell her some good news. Because of the success of the angle with Owen, Jim and Davey were going to be hired back. That is if Davey could get out from under his assault charge. From the lilt in her voice, I could tell that the jolt of joy was as good for her as the electrical one the doctors had given her heart. I told her I'd come up to see her and Stu that Tuesday to wish Stu a happy 79th birthday before I left for a tour of Japan. I arrived at Hart House around 4:30 with Julie and the kids in tow and parked beside Owen's new van. I couldn't help but smile at seeing one of my mom's crayon signs taped to the outside of the kitchen door. "Happy 79th birthday, Grampy." She'd hang a perfectly lettered sign with the relevant details for birthdays and other occasions because with such a big family, it helped everyone to keep track. We barged into the kitchen, and I could see Stu's tattered ostrich-skin cowboy boots sticking out of the stairwell where he was sitting talking on the phone. He put his huge hand over the receiver and bellowed upstairs to my mom, "Tiger, there's someone here to see you." Jade clamped a large toy tiger in her arms, and Beans carried a small gift box in tiger-striped wrapping as I heard the flip-flop of my mom's slippers coming down the stairs. Stu wasn't so big on receiving presents but loved it when we brought something with us for my mom. Over the years, Stu affectionately modified my mom's nickname from Tiger Bell to Tiger Balls. She let out her gorgeous laugh when she saw that the box was filled with tiger-striped ping-pong balls. Soon a pot of coffee was brewing. Stu was still trapped on the phone. My mom explained, "It's Diana. She and Ellie call him every single day about Jim and Davey." She cupped her hand over her mouth to whisper, "They're losing everything now." I wanted to wish my dad a happy birthday. My mom pleaded with him to get off the phone, but Stu had a hard time saying no to his daughters, and the conversation stretched on. Stu finally told Diana that he just wanted to say goodbye to me before I left, and she took offense. With a pained look, he sighed. She hung up on me. I shook his hand, but the phone rang again. This time it was Ellie. Stu put his hand up, signaling me that he didn't want me to go, so I chatted with my mom a while longer. After a few minutes he set the phone down to tell me Ellie wanted to thank me herself for the new break for Jim. But Ellie was cold and distant as she went on a bitter rant about how Vince McMahon owed her and Jim a living, conveniently overlooking the fact that it had been Jim who'd got himself fired in the first place and that he was lucky to be hired back at all after throwing that TV monitor at Chief. As far as I knew, Jim hadn't paid Vince back for the lawyers who'd won him the settlement, which was all gone now anyway. When I hung up, I realized that she hadn't thanked me for anything. There was a lot of doom and gloom at WWF headquarters. Vince had to pay out 2 huge settlements, one to Jesse Ventura for $810,000 in back royalties and a staggering $26.7 million to Chad Austin, the jobber paralyzed by the Rockers. Not to mention that Vince's trial was fast approaching. Bam Bam and Yoko, who kept up with the business in Japan, warned me that the WWF tour was going to bomb big time. That first day, the Japanese press was mostly interested in the impact of Hogan going to WCW and Vince's legal woes rather than the tour itself. Nonetheless, when I peeked through the curtain at the crowd in Yokohama, it wasn't such a bad house after all. I was working a title match with Macho Man. Although he'd never worked Japan, his exposure on Vince's TV had made him a legend over there. He saw me as the ideal opponent to, in a sense, restore him to his proper place. Vince hadn't done anything with him for so long that it was beginning to eat at him. All Randy wanted was a little respect. When Jack Lanza came to us and flatly said to me, "Catch something quick on him," it wasn't hard to read the dejected look on Randy's face. It showed Randy how little the office cared. Not so long ago, Lanza would never have spoken to Randy like he was a jobber. So I told Randy, "Let's just do it for us." We went out that night and had a beautiful match, although I did give him a small spud when he caught a boot in the face, opening a gash in his eyebrow. The blood only added to the drama, and the usually somber Japanese fans came to their feet when I slapped on the sharpshooter and Randy tapped out. "Sorry about your eye," I said back in the dressing room. It was a deep cut, but he smiled and said, "That's okay, it's good for the business." Lanza came up to us, his bad eye looking like a burned-out headlight, and swatted us on our asses with his clipboard. "Great, guys." Randy shot back, "Save it, Lanza." I thought the Japanese media would appreciate how I worked completely different matches with Macho, Yoko, and Bam Bam, but it didn't seem to mean anything to them. I thought back to Puerto Rico and couldn't believe it had been 16 years since I was a naive kid sitting out on the rocks in the ocean promising myself that I'd make my mark in this crazy wrestling business. I owed so much to my old teacher, mentor and friend Mr. Hito. Upon arriving in Osaka, Owen and I went to visit him at his restaurant. He looked thin and beat up and I could see every dent and scar, but he was just as sharp as ever. He cooked us up a Korean barbecue, and while we talked I thought back to when he taught me the art of wrestling, how to fall, how to protect myself, and how to protect the guy I worked with. When I thought about the Rockers breaking Chad Austin's neck, it dawned on me that thanks to Hito, I'd never seriously injured a single wrestler. From what he said, it seemed Hito was wise enough to be content being an old dog chained to the porch, yet I sensed he really missed the way things used to be. The night before the final show of the tour, I sat with a dog-faced 1-2-3 kid in Sapporo. By the end of our one day off, we had grown tired of samurai soap operas. Restless at the hotel, we had ended up at a sleazy fuck show. Only a little while back I was bobbing around in the Dead Sea. How did I end up here? Pretty Russian girls were lying on the stage rolling condoms over tiny thumb-like dicks, getting fucked and giving blowjobs, while Japanese businessmen fingered them and laughed. It's strange where people end up in life. A voice in my head reminded me that once upon a time I cut my head with a razor for $50 a night, and thought nothing of it. After the last show, we were bussed straight from the arena to a chartered plane for an 8-hour flight to Guam. We all slept on the plane and ate only dry cucumber sandwiches that we washed down with beer. When we landed, we were sent straight to the building like cattle. In the dressing room, wrestlers were flopped out on dirty floors, too tired to chow down on pizza. Owen and I spotted a fully stocked gym out back, and as wiped out as we were, we squeezed in an intense workout. We hadn't seen a gym in 2 weeks. More than once that night, I felt my legs buckle and go out from under me, but the crowd was so pumped up we couldn't help but work hard for them. After the show, we went straight back to the airport. All I remember of Guam is a few palm trees. Back on the chartered plane, the only thing to eat was more pizza, with plenty of beer to wash it down. Like hungry animals, we obliged. We crossed the international date line, and when we landed in Honolulu, we lived the entire day of May 12, 1994 all over again. Like Guam was just a dream. Owen had turned 29 a few days earlier, so I suggested to him that he stay over with me to celebrate in Hawaii. My 2 surfer dudes were waiting at baggage claim, only now there were 3 of them. Tate's younger brother, Todd, had come along. While Owen and I always made a point of kayfabbing, today would be a rare exception because the surfer dudes couldn't care less about our storyline. We went straight to the beach, where we strapped on some life jackets and took off in a 6-man rubber dinghy. The sun was high and bright, and waves splashed my hand as it hung over the side. Owen and I each held a beer, and he was as purely happy as I'd ever seen him, and then maybe so was I. After about a half hour we coasted close to the shore, ready to get back on land, when Chris decided he wanted to show us the barrier reef, where the ocean floor drops off a couple of miles offshore. A few minutes later he idled the dinghy and pointed to where the blue water fades to black and said, "That's hundreds of feet deep." Then the motor cut out. From the worried looks on the surfer dudes' faces, I realized we were out of gas. Tate kept asking Chris whether he thought he could swim ashore. Chris stood on his tiptoes and peered out at Waikiki, a couple of miles away. No sooner did Chris decide that he could do it than he changed his mind. He explained that there had been shark attacks in the area recently. We had no flares, no food, no drink, and we were drifting farther and farther out to sea. Owen thought it was all a rib and just smiled at me. Owen, I'm not kidding. Good try, Brett. After a half hour, when we really started to cook in the hot sun, it dawned on Owen that this was no joke. All we could do was hope that someone would rescue us, maybe the Coast Guard. Finally, Christian decided that waiting wasn't going to get the job done and dove into the water. I feared for him, but he was a terrific swimmer. I reminded Owen of the episode of The Simpsons where Homer gets lost at sea, but Owen was in no mood for humor. Then I joked about what would happen if Owen and I were lost for several weeks. Perhaps we could even upstage the negative headlines about Vince and be seen as a welcome diversion. The whole wrestling world, along with our friends and families, would search everywhere for us, and finally when we were rescued, when we would meet the onrush of reporters, Owen and I would kayfabe like the pros we were and persuade them that despite being lost at sea in a dinghy we still weren't talking to each other. A smile started to break on Owen's face, and we were both grinning as we caught sight of a motorboat speeding toward us carrying Chris waving a gas can. In no time we were safe on Waikiki Beach. Afterwards, Owen and I went back to the saltwater pool and gorged on fried chicken and cold beer. That night Taker was back on the card. He'd been home for a few months and it was great to see him. After the show, Owen and I went back to kayfabbing because there were too many fans around, but later on, like two colliding marching bands, the babyfaces and the heels ran into one another on a Honolulu street corner. Lost wrestlers. Ones like Owen, who were out long past their bedtimes. Ones so cheap they wouldn't blow their dough on beer or girls or expensive hotel rooms. And, of course, wild ones, who lived just for moments like this. Nobody had slept yet and delirium was setting in. Taker had a grin on his face like Jack Nicholson when he got returned to the ward in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. We soon sat at a crowded strip bar with beautiful, naked girls prancing around us. Everyone was doing shots in honor of Owen's birthday and Taker's return. I hugged Owen on a street corner just before he left for the airport. It was one of the few times I ever saw him celebrate. He was drunker than I could ever remember him being, smiling his face off, sunburned and swaying. I slapped him on the shoulder. I'm happy for ya. Ooh ya. About time you let your hair down. I had such a great day, he said. I'll never forget it. And neither would I. Hours later I lay in bed, the room spinning just a bit. I wasn't expecting anything as the China doll I'd brought back to my room stared at the ocean from my balcony. She turned around casually, unbuttoning her white blouse. I was captivated by her shy smile. As she worked my jeans off, I looked deep into her cat-like eyes. My lust was always stronger than my guilt. I felt like I was being carried by a strong current in a fast river. With Owen and me headlining, Anaheim, San Jose, Chicago and New York did the best house show business since the glory days of Hulkamania. We were each making $7,000 to $10,000 a week. Even Martha stopped hating wrestling for a while. We headed back to Europe at the end of May, landing in Nuremberg on May 29th. After the show that night, I asked one of the locals where there was a good rock and roll bar and he suggested a place called Lizard Lounge. I told Oscar, the manager from Men on a Mission, to meet me there, but when I showed up with Kid, my faithful sidekick of late, it turned out to be a heavy metal hangout with neo-Nazi skinheads guarding the door. Then Oscar strolled through the front doors, oblivious to the slack jaws and scowls of the doorman. When he said, "What's up, Brett?" I told him to stay real close. Only then did he check out the place and realize he might as well have come to a Klan rally. But Oscar was a man, and he wasn't going anywhere. So we had a few beers and Oscar confided that he was afraid that something was going to go off between him and Sean, Razor and Diesel, who'd made it clear that they didn't like MOM. I told Oscar if it got serious to tell me and I'd keep an eye on things. Then Oscar shuffled out, nodding politely to the skinheads at the door, who nodded back dumbfounded, no doubt wondering whether he had brass balls or no brains. By 4 a.m, Kid and I were at the Green Goose, which was packed with American GIs and drunken WWF fans who spent every mark they had traveling from town to town partying every night with the touring wrestlers. Kamala's former ring manager, Harvey Whippleman, had met an English fan in Germany and married her like she was a mail-order bride. Yoko, a big, fat bullfrog with a ponytail, sat perched on his lily pad, a cigarette hanging from his lips next to Mabel, black as coal and as big as a mountain. Which lucky girl would win their hearts? Diesel weaved his way toward me through the sweaty mob. Vince had just put the IC belt on him so he could work with me at King of the Ring. Since he'd come to the WWF, he had only been Sean's bodyguard, and he was worried about how he would handle our match. I liked Kevin and said I would do all that I could to make him look good. He told me that earlier that evening, Sean and Razor got so wasted on pills and booze that some fans helped them back to the hotel and tucked them into their beds. The pill problem was getting dangerously out of control. Berlin was the crown of the tour. When I did an autograph session, they had to shut down major downtown streets. I signed for more than 4 hours to keep the peace. Then it was on to Italy. In Milan, after a barn burner with Owen, I stood on the middle rope in the corner watching him storm down the aisle, turning back to flip me the bird. I nearly burst out laughing as he jammed his thumbs under his armpits and flapped his elbows, shouting, "You're a chicken." My music blared as young kids pressed in around the barricades and I high-fived hundreds of eager hands as I made my way down the aisle. I couldn't help but feel as though my hand had been touched by angels. The next day the bus drove by the ruins of the Colosseum in Rome, where gladiators had once fought starved and tormented lions, tigers and bears to the death as a form of entertainment. Near the Colosseum hung color posters trumpeting the rivalry between Owen and me. Whatever it was that we were doing certainly made more sense than what they did back then. Who'd have ever thought that two Hart brothers would battle it out in Rome right across from the Colosseum? Sometimes it was too much for both of us.